I think you heard my saying at the beginning, these escalatory moves that Joe Biden, quote unquote, or who's ever acting in his name, have taken. And the most escalatory one, the riskiest one, is the use of ATACMS, because the Russians have said, and they're absolutely correct, that the Ukrainians can't launch these on their own. You have to have the direct involvement of the Americans or the NATO military, which means we're now actively involved in bombing Russia, basically. NATO is bombing Russia. The U.S. is bombing Russia. What do you make of the dangers of this over the next couple months, and why do you think, quote unquote, Joe Biden and the Biden White House are so recklessly escalating this now on their way out?
I mean, I'm not sure to answer that last part. I don't know. Scott Horton, who just wrote his book, Provoked, just came out, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, he's going to be on our show tomorrow.
The best book.
He's going to be on our show tomorrow.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I mean, the book is so good, and he's just he just lays out the most devastating case for how the West provoked this conflict at every single turn since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what he said, I heard he said earlier today that maybe it's just kind of like they feel like now that Putin knows Trump's coming in, he's not going to do anything crazy now because he knows a negotiation, so we can give him another black eye or be in a slightly better negotiating place after that. I hope that's the answer to it. But, I'm still, it's just, I know it's been years at this point, but I am somebody who for a living, I live in the world of, this government is so corrupt and here's everything that's corrupt about it. And I still have my jaw on the ground that they are this reckless. I mean, and I think people if you have some perspective of the history of the Cold War, the first Cold War, I mean, we embarked on crazy policies and fought these brutal wars. I mean, just like absolute catastrophes like Vietnam, where it just made absolutely no sense. The theory was all wrong. All this domino theory nonsense. It was just all completely wrong, and just so many people got slaughtered, and such a waste of money and resources. But even in that time, at least the leaders treated the profound risk of nuclear war with some degree of seriousness. I mean, we never did anything like this when it was the Soviet Union, who had control of half of Europe, and at least kind of in theory, their ideology was that the entire world would fall under this communist umbrella, and were expansionist in nature. And even then, Vietnam, fighting a proxy war with Russia in Vietnam is there's China in between them. It wasn't right on their border. It certainly wasn't approving strikes within Russia. And, to just see them. So there's that thing, which is totally unprecedented. You can't imagine. And the degree to which people just don't even seem to have any serious consideration for this risk. And then on top of that, I've just never really seen an example before. Maybe you know this stuff better than me, but an example where after an election in a lame duck session where essentially, the candidate who won pretty decisively won on ending the war, and then you're going to take these provocative steps when he's 2 months away from coming into the White House. This would be like George W. Bush surging in Iraq after Obama beat John McCain in November of 2008. I can't think of another example like this. It's just all so wild and so reckless and so clearly motivated by some certain self-interest or special interest, and not what's good for the country or the world.
Yeah, I think the U.S. security state fears that Trump is going to come in and end the war, and Russia is going to end up with a huge chunk of Ukraine, which they're going to end up with no matter what. They would have ended up, everyone in Europe is done with this war. They understand there's no way to expel the Russians from Ukraine. The Russians have paid a huge price to basically get 25% of Ukraine, and they're not going to give that up easily. They're not going to give it up at all. That they're going to drive a very hard bargain, given the price that they paid, that they had to fight a war for 3 years against NATO. I think that what the Biden administration is doing is trying to make it as difficult as possible for Trump to resolve the war, even though he ran his campaign on a promise to do that, and that's what Americans wanted, by preventing it from being what it has been over the last 6 months, which is a more or less stable conflict where the Russians are advancing, but not very rapidly. And people are starting to accept that the Russians are, the only deal to make is, okay, the Russians are going to get to use eastern Ukraine as a buffer. They're going to obviously keep Crimea, and there's going to have to be a pledge that Ukraine will never join NATO, will not join NATO for the next 40 years or whatever. And everyone knows that's the deal. And I think it becomes a lot more difficult to make a deal like that if you're spiraling up the escalation ladder. But as you say, you know, the thing that I think is so different, you recounted that important history of the Cold War. Both sides were petrified of a nuclear war. It was central to everybody's level of fear. You talk to anybody who grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, nuclear war was the thing that they were talking about the most in school. They were training to how to go into bunkers. And even then, when you had the Soviet Union, a much bigger threat than what Russia is, that the United States viewed as an existential threat to the world, to freedom, all of that, fighting wars all over the place, American and Soviet leaders spoke all the time. They spoke at every level of the government to make sure there was no misconception, misperception, misunderstanding. And ever since Russiagate, it has been basically taboo to have an American official meet. I mean, Nixon and JFK and Reagan constantly met with Russian leaders. Imagine if Trump tried to meet with the Russian leader to resolve this war. You can understand what would happen instantly. Biden and his administration don't talk to the Russians. For me, the insanity of this all comes from Russiagate. It comes from the attempt to convince Americans that Russia is the gravest threat to our country. What do you think Russiagate is sort of the original sin here?
Well, I think so. My theory on it is I think the original sin of Vladimir Putin was Syria. And that's really what made him an enemy of the American regime, at least on a different level. I mean, if you look at, say, like what year did he go into Syria? It was 2014, 2015. If you look before that, you're not going to find examples of the American elites talking about Vladimir Putin in the way that they have since then. You know, obviously George W. Bush famously said he looked him in the eyes and he could tell he was a good man. And Hillary Clinton did that whole reset button thing. And, you know, Barack Obama, of course, as you remember well, in 2012 mocked Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was our big enemy. And so for the message of the kind of war party was not what it is now. No one was pretending that this guy was some type of, imperialist or hell-bent on reclaiming the Soviet Union. And what happened was his true crime was he denied the U.S. regime. He denied the U.S. regime a regime change in Syria. And that's a big no-no. And, you know, there were a lot of very powerful forces who had a plan there, and that plan involved Bashar al-Assad being overthrown. You know, you could listen to General Wesley Clark, who's four-star general, claims that he saw the plans back in 2001. This is something they were working toward for a long time, and particularly after the war in Iraq gave so much more influence to Iran in the region, and then the Saudis were furious, and Israel wasn't too happy about Iran's influence in the region. And so this was the plan, to overthrow him. And Vladimir Putin denied the U.S. that successfully. And then, of course, you have, just as this conflict in Syria is still going on, you have Donald Trump running for president, and he was running on détente with Russia. And why can't we be friends? Very openly in the 2016 campaign. And this was part of his platform, that he was like, hey, why don't we be friends? Hey, Vladimir Putin wants to kill ISIS. That sounds a lot like what I want to do. So I don't care about Bashar al-Assad, and I think we should kill ISIS together and be friends and get along. And then he was framed for being a Russian spy. And so to me, it was like really the starting point of being on this huge escalation. And again, you're having Scott on tomorrow. He's the guy to talk to about it. It's true that we've been escalating the conflict since the end of the Cold War and basically started up a new Cold War right away. But to me, I think it took a whole different level. It took a whole different level after we failed in Syria, in large part due to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, absolutely. The United States doesn't react well when their foreign policy goals are impeded, the CIA dirty wars are undermined. I want to spend some time on the Trump nominations, but I just, as the last topic, before we get there, I just want to make this observation and ask you what you think about it, which is there's this amazing data trend where you go back to almost every war over the last 6 decades, starting with Vietnam, going through the 1980s dirty wars in Central America, heading into the war on terror with the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, the war in Afghanistan, where the same dynamic is observable, which is at the beginning of the war, huge majorities of Americans support it. They're very good at getting Americans riled up to support this wars. But eventually, over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you see it with Ukraine now, Americans come to say that war wasn't worth it. It was a huge mistake. The percentage of people willing to admit they supported the war, so at the time it'll be like 68 or 75% of Americans support the war, and then you ask them 5 years later, did you support this war? And only 35% will admit it. Most will say it was a mistake. And yet, every single time there's a new war to sell, as happened in Russia and Ukraine, it's like none of that ever happened. People don't remember. They're like, no, this war is the just war. This war is the good war that we're actually going to be able to win and do good with. What do you think accounts for this potency of war propaganda, even on people who have lived through it so many times and have come to realize that they were misled?
I mean, I could more easily give you an answer for what accounts for them waking up to it, which is that all of the wars are sold on lies. Every single one of them. I mean, literally every single one that you just named, from Vietnam all the way up to current, it's all sold on lies, and blatant lies that are demonstrably false, that later are even admitted by the people who pushed the lies. And so, it's easy to wake up after a while to that. And of course, this war in Ukraine was no different. I mean, it was just lies, 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 lies the whole way through. I mean, it was, first off, the starting point of it being unprovoked was a complete bold-faced lie. The ghost of Kiev was a lie. We can win the war with sanctions was a lie. It just goes
We're going to collapse our economy. We're going to collapse the ruble.
Yes, the Putin blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, it's just lie, 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 lie the whole way through. And so, yeah, it is. I mean, they're good at the propaganda, I guess, to some degree. And it is remarkable that they were still able to fool so many people. I do think so. This is the area where I'm most hopeful. And this, to me, I actually think is the best part about Donald Trump winning. Why, even with all of these bad things we're talking about, I still think it's much better for the country that Donald Trump won and Kamala Harris lost, because I do think that the corporate media apparatus has been just like dismantled in a way that even it hadn't been in 2016 or 2020 or any of the years in between. It's just different. Like, they've all almost admitted that the real action is with Joe Rogan and with all these podcasts and all these shows on the internet. And I think that I think COVID was a really huge part of this, and Ukraine came right on the heels of COVID, and people, I think, in a way, were kind of relieved to switch the propaganda over to Ukraine. All the same people who had their masks on got their Ukraine flags up on Twitter, and I just think even a lot of those people have woken up to how the whole COVID stuff was all lies now too, and at the time, maybe they hadn't. And so I think it is getting harder and harder for them to sell the next thing. But I don't have a good answer for you. I'm kind of amazed that they're able to sell any of these conflicts. You would think, after just all the disasters that you listed, every one of those wars a disaster, that by now the American people would be at the point where they were like, we don't believe you when you're trying to sell the next war.
Yeah, but they did. I mean, you can see it happening right after the Russian invasion in February 2022. Yeah. Every media outlet, every major faction was all on the exact same page about what this was. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.